This is the foundation of the greatest military blunder in history. It wasn't built on tactical failure, but on wishful thinking. To understand the misjudgment of Japan, we must first meet the one man who saw the truth, Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was no stranger to the giant he was being asked to fight. He spent years in the United States, studying at Harvard, touring the cavernous factories of Detroit, and witnessing the endless flow of crude oil from the fields of Texas. He did not see a soft nation. He saw a sleeping industrial titan. Yamamoto's message to the Japanese Imperial Command was clear, absolute, and utterly rejected. If I am commanded to make war on the United States, I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year. The strategic miscalculation was rooted in a failure of arithmetic. Japan's leaders believed that their martial spirit, their Bushido, would overcome America's material strength. They looked at the current size of the U.S. Navy and thought only in terms of ships and planes currently built. They fatally underestimated the concept of potential energy. The United States, having never focused on war production, possessed a civilian industrial base that was unmatched in human history. Factories that made cars could make tanks. Factories that made appliances could make aircraft parts. They were not starting from scratch. They were simply hitting a switch. The plan was perfect. Strike Pearl Harbor, cripple the fleet, and seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. This would create a vast defensive perimeter, forcing America to fight a costly, prolonged campaign that its soft populace would eventually tire of. They believed their military might was a substitute for industrial might. But what Yamamoto knew and his superiors ignored was that the sleeping giant had been violently woken. The United States was about to unleash an industrial miracle, a material Schlacht, material battle that Japan could never hope to win. In the final analysis, Japan's leaders didn't misjudge the U.S. Navy, they misjudged the American auto worker, the steel mill, and the oil refinery. They believed they had bought 6 months of tactical advantage, but they had merely condemned themselves to 4 years of inescapable, overwhelming industrial defeat. The sound of the first shots at Pearl Harbor was the sound of a warning unheeded. The true war was never fought in the skies over the Pacific, but in the factories of America, a war Japan had lost before it even began.
The Imperial Japanese High Command did not just misread the balance sheets of Detroit, they fundamentally misread the soul of the American people. The fatal assumption, born of deep-seated cultural arrogance, was that America, a decadent democracy, lacked the moral fiber, the unity, and the sheer will necessary to sustain a brutal, long-term war against the iron discipline of the emperor's soldiers. What did they see? They saw a nation consumed by consumerism, divided by labor disputes, and distracted by Hollywood fantasy. They saw a society where comfort was paramount and personal freedom was cherished. This, they concluded, made the American citizenry soft, incapable of bearing the sacrifices required by total war. The cornerstone of this flawed judgment was the comparison between the warrior code of Bushido and the perceived lack of a unified national ideology in the West. To the Japanese military, the idea of surrender was an unthinkable disgrace. Life was secondary to duty. They projected this intense, absolute dedication onto their enemy and found it wanting. They expected America to flinch. The strategy for war was built entirely on this psychological fragility. The plan was not to defeat America in a prolonged slugfest. Yamamoto had warned against that. The plan was to deliver a single overwhelming blow at Pearl Harbor, stunning the enemy, and then quickly establish an impenetrable defensive perimeter throughout the Pacific. Japan gambled that the shock of Pearl Harbor, coupled with the immediate loss of key naval assets, would trigger a powerful wave of isolationist sentiment and political infighting. They believed the American public, unwilling to endure years of hardship and bloodshed thousands of miles away, would force its government to negotiate a peace that left the Japanese Empire intact. They were wrong, and they were wrong immediately. December 7, 1941, did not paralyze the American people. It unified them with a blinding, white-hot clarity. The surprise attack was not seen as a bargaining chip. It was seen as an unforgivable act of treachery. Within days, the divisions that had plagued American politics, the debates between isolationism and interventionism, vanished. The anger was absolute. The political will to pursue a total, decisive victory without compromise became the single most powerful unifying force in U.S. history. The Japanese command had viewed American military performance with contempt. They saw a peacetime force that was slow, cautious, and untrained. What they failed to grasp was the massive, innate capacity of a democracy to organize and dedicate itself to a single, overriding goal once its survival was threatened. The concept of softness evaporated overnight. 16 million Americans from every corner of the vast, diverse nation answered the call to serve. They were men who had been farmers, mechanics, students, and businessmen one day, and they were dedicated to becoming hardened warriors the next. This was not a small professional elite. This was the entirety of the nation mobilized. The civilian sacrifice, too, was absolute. Rationing, barn wars, and an unforgiving demand for industrial output became the daily reality. The nation that Japan believed would falter had simply traded its pursuit of happiness for the pursuit of victory. Japan was convinced that the U.S. would pivot its focus completely to the war in Europe, leaving the Pacific to atrophy. This was a grave misjudgment. Even while dedicating massive resources to fighting Hitler, the Americans fought the Pacific War with an unrelenting, ferocious commitment, never once pausing to consider the negotiated peace Japan desperately hoped for. The Japanese were expecting a negotiation partner. They found an enraged executioner. Their fatal miscalculation was simple. They had judged America by the standards of a peacetime nation, failing to understand the terrifying potential of a nation united, angered, and fully dedicated to destroying its adversary. The psychological miscalculation ensured that the industrial giant would be wielded with an unbreakable will. The next stage of their misjudgment would cost them everything. As the Americans poured onto the shores of Guadalcanal, the Japanese would be forced to confront the terrifying reality. Their enemy was neither soft nor divided. They were here to fight to the last man.
In the first 6 months of the war, the Japanese military could be forgiven for believing their narrative. The Zero fighter was a legend, the American defenses were slow to react, and their victories felt absolute. They saw what they expected, an enemy that was, tactically and operationally, inferior. Yet this contempt was another fatal oversight. Japan failed to appreciate the massive, systemic ability of the American military to learn, adapt, and industrialize its lessons with unparalleled speed. The defeats weren't seen as proof of inadequacy, but as data points for rapid, lethal improvement. Take, for instance, air combat. When early American pilots faced the Zero, they were immediately outmatched in a low-speed turning fight. But instead of continuing to lose, pilots and tacticians quickly developed new doctrines, most famously the Thach Weave. This simple defensive tactic turned a disadvantage into a deadly ambush, immediately neutralizing the Zero's primary strength. The Zero itself never fundamentally changed. The American response changed everything. The speed of technological evolution was perhaps the most brutal shock. Japan's aircraft designs remained largely static, dedicated to lightweight performance at the expense of pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. America, powered by the industrial base we discussed, could iterate and replace. The early Wildcat gave way to the faster, tougher Corsair, and most devastatingly, the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was not just a better plane, it was the industrial answer to the Zero. It was built to absorb damage and to fly, quite literally, straight out of the factory onto a carrier deck. Within 2 years of Pearl Harbor, American pilots, flying this new generation of aircraft, were able to execute boom and zoom tactics, denying the Zero its turns and relying on sheer speed and altitude to deliver a killing blow. The result was the infamous Marianas Turkey Shoot, where in a single day, Japan lost over 300 aircraft and countless irreplaceable veteran pilots. It was the moment the myth of Japanese air superiority died. Japan was making planes, America was making systems of destruction. This systematic learning wasn't confined to the air. On the ground, the Japanese believed that every island could be turned into a fortress, demanding a costly frontal assault. They planned on attrition. But American strategists, realizing the cost, quickly developed the brilliant and devastating island-hopping campaign. Why fight for months and lose thousands of men for a heavily defended rock like Rabaul when you could simply bypass it, cut off its supply lines, and let it wither into irrelevance? This strategy transformed the immense distances of the Pacific from a Japanese defense advantage into an American logistical weapon. The speed of the American advance went from a crawl to a terrifying sprint. Every battle, every engagement was fed back into the American industrial and training pipeline. Deficiencies were corrected with a speed that was impossible for Japan's rigid, resource-starved command structure. This wasn't merely bravery. This was the methodical, unstoppable power of a democracy mobilized for efficiency. Japan had prepared for a war of attrition, hoping to break American morale. Instead, they got a war of systemic annihilation, a relentless, accelerating industrial process that consumed their forces, their territories, and their best pilots. They were not fighting a weak enemy. They were fighting a machine designed to evolve and destroy, built on the solid foundation of their own fatal misjudgment. By early 1945, the war had ceased to be a war of maneuver and had become, by Japan's own design, a war of attrition. Yet, the one critical factor the Japanese military leaders continued to misread was the threshold of American will. They believed that if they made every island battle bloody enough, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the American public would eventually tire of the mounting casualty lists and demand a negotiated settlement. The Japanese defense was fanatical, sacrificing nearly every defender on Okinawa. But the strategy was built on a delusion. The high cost didn't break American resolve, it hardened the American political stance. It didn't force a negotiation, it convinced American planners that any landing on the home islands would be a human catastrophe, a catastrophe they had the absolute industrial and moral authority to prevent. This led to the planning of Operation Downfall, the two-stage invasion of the Japanese home islands. The scale of this operation, codenamed Olympic for the initial landing on Kyushu in November 1945 and Coronet for the push on the Tokyo plain in spring 1946, was unprecedented. American intelligence, already bloodied by Okinawa, watched in horror as Japanese forces on Kyushu swelled. Initial estimates of 4 hostile divisions quickly rose to nearly 9 divisions identified by midsummer, with Japan eventually possessing almost 600,000 men ready to defend the southern island in deeply fortified positions. Furthermore, the Japanese High Command activated the Ketsugo Defense Plan, a doctrine of national annihilation. This meant that the line between soldier and civilian would disappear entirely. every citizen, men, women, and children, was psychologically and physically mobilized to fight to the death, armed with everything from primitive lunge mines to bamboo spears. The Japanese Air Force, thought to be crippled, was secretly hoarding over 10,000 aircraft, many being simple wooden trainers, to be used in a massive coordinated kamikaze strike against the invasion transports. U.S. Navy planners estimated a potential loss rate of 50% of the landing transports as they positioned to disembark troops. Faced with the prospect of an Olympic invasion that would lead to casualties possibly exceeding 1 million Americans and Japanese deaths in the multiple millions, the political will in Washington hardened further. The strategy of unconditional surrender was no longer just a demand. It was viewed as a humanitarian necessity to end the madness. On July 26, 1945, the Allied powers issued the Potsdam Declaration, making the demand official. The message was explicit. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese leadership, the Big Six, debated the ultimatum endlessly. They were paralyzed by the single condition they could not accept, the complete end of the emperor's sovereign authority, kokutai. They foolishly chose to ignore the ultimatum, hoping to leverage the Soviet Union, still neutral, to mediate a better peace. On August 6, 1945, Japan's final fatal miscalculation met its ultimate consequence. The industrial supremacy of America, which Yamamoto had warned about, was unveiled in its most terrible, non-negotiable form. The atomic bomb instantly rendered Operation Downfall strategically optional, and the Japanese government's hopes for delay utterly meaningless. The simultaneous declaration of war by the Soviet Union on August 8 was the final nail in the coffin. Japan now faced a war on two fronts with no hope of mediation. The world America had promised, prompt and utter destruction, had arrived. It took the personal intervention of Emperor Hirohito, a wrenching break with centuries of tradition, to override the hardliners and accept the Potsdam terms. His broadcast on August 15th, acknowledging the defeat, was the sound of a proud nation finally confronting the truth its military leaders had tried to deny for 4 years. The formal surrender on September 2, 1945, was the final indelible image of the entire conflict. The battleship USS Missouri, built in America's industrial surge, anchored in the heart of Tokyo Bay, served as the ultimate stage for the signing. The Japanese representatives, standing before the might of the Allied world, signed the document that confirmed Yamamoto's prophecy. Japan did not lose the war in the Pacific. It lost the war in the fundamental misjudgment of a people they called soft and an industrial machine they failed to measure. The consequences were tragic, but the lesson is timeless. Never underestimate the power of a determined democracy when its core values are threatened.